The coronavirus is sweeping around the world.
We have a simple message for all countries: test, test, test.
It's a global emergency like we've never seen before.
I've been following events from here in Brussels, and Europe really is at the absolute epicenter of this crisis right now. In many countries around the continent, the number of cases and the number of deaths is increasing by 30% every single day. Think about it. That means every 3 days, the number doubles.
Italy is ground zero, and its healthcare system is buckling under the pressure. Scenes like this could come soon in Spain, France and Germany too. And European leaders are warning it could get much, much worse.
Wenn das Virus da ist und noch keine Immunität der Bevölkerung gegenüber diesem Virus vorliegt, keine Impfmöglichkeiten existieren, auch noch keine Therapiemöglichkeiten, dass dann ein hoher Prozentsatz, Experten sagen 60-70% der Bevölkerung infiziert werden, solange dieser Zustand so bleibt.
And the US isn't far behind, although the president insists he is on top of things.
And on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your response to this crisis?
I'd rate it a 10.
But the markets don't seem to agree. The economy is heading for a huge recession.
Back in China, where it all began, the worst seems to be over, at least for now.
Infections are down dramatically from their peak, and President Xi Jinping has been to visit healthcare workers in the city of Wuhan, which is China's ground zero. Some have said that China's response is a model for the world, an extreme lockdown that helped to slow the virus's spread. A makeshift hospital built in a matter of days, all made possible by an authoritarian regime that's able to act quickly and decisively.
Is that true? Do you need to be a dictatorship to handle a killer virus? Are Europe and the US at a fatal disadvantage in tackling this intense crisis?
We need to become aware that Europe can do many things, but it cannot handle, as a risk manager, a pandemic response. And obviously, this looks like a very manifest weakness we have.
I think people are very worried that we may have lost valuable time, and that means that the curve will be more severe than it has needed to be.
A lot of people are kind of almost looking at China with envy, saying, wow, I guess authoritarianism kind of works because they were able to just shut things down and now the virus is contained in China.
We're going to compare these three big players: China, where it all began, Europe, now at the center of the pandemic, and the US, where infections are spreading fast.
We're going to look at what's going wrong, what's going right, and what global politics might look like after this crisis is over. Now, before we jump in, I want to stress a couple of things. First of all, it's obviously going to be a long time before we can draw really solid conclusions about all of this. Probably at least a couple of years before the dust has really settled on this crisis. So think of this as a kind of early, real-time snapshot of how things are going at an early stage in a crisis like this. And then secondly, what this video is not. It's not about the science. Now, if you want some content about the science of the coronavirus, there's lots of it right here on DW News. But right now, we want to talk about politics.
Europe's politicians are in overdrive right now. Over the past couple of weeks, every leader around the European Union has announced measures they probably never could have imagined outside of a war. They've been jolted into action by the crisis in northern Italy. There, an explosive outbreak has stunned the country and left thousands of people dead. Per head of population, it's already much worse than it was in China. Europe's open internal borders and highly integrated economy meant it wouldn't be long before the virus was everywhere.
Many countries around Europe have been responding with all sorts of measures kind of lifted right from that Chinese playbook. They've been imposing tighter and tighter restrictions on movement, right up to national police-enforced curfews, and they've been imposing controls on many of those internal European borders.
È per questo che sto per firmare un provvedimento che possiamo sintetizzare con l'espressione «Io resto a casa».
Dès demain, midi, et pour 15 jours au moins, nos déplacements seront très fortement réduits.
Es ist ernst. Nehmen Sie es auch ernst. Seit der deutschen Einheit, nein, seit dem Zweiten Weltkrieg, gab es keine Herausforderung an unser Land mehr, bei der es so sehr auf unser gemeinsames, solidarisches Handeln ankommt.
Right here in Brussels, people have been asked to work from home if they possibly can, and that does mean that you have fewer people than usual out on the streets, even though it's not yet an absolute curfew.
I've mostly been working from home too, so you'll see the interviews up next were all filmed on Skype in my little apartment here. It's not exactly studio quality, but it is quite fitting, because all the experts I spoke to were having to work from home as well. EU law professor Alberto Alemano joined me from home curfew in Paris. He told me the problem with all that action from European countries is that each has been going it alone.
We are in a situation in which today Germans can still walk freely in their cities, but Italians and Spaniards, they cannot. They are home confined. A situation in which British kids or kids in Northern Ireland are still going to school, but most of their peers across Europe, they cannot go to school. Shops are open in Sweden right now.
The EU's top officials have been trying in recent days to coordinate, with video conferences among all the national leaders. Sometimes they've rushed to patch up problems with measures like unilateral border controls, which run the risk of damaging hold-ups to essential goods.
Our healthcare system is under huge pressure. Therefore, member states have taken strong measures to slow down the spread of the virus. These measures are effective only when they are coordinated. In this moment of crisis, it is of utmost importance to keep our internal market going. In general, measures taken at national level can only be effective if they are coordinated with neighboring countries, in particular in border regions.
Bottom line is that the European Union as such cannot lock down cities, cannot close schools, cannot stop sport matches. Those are competences that belong to the member states of the Union. So we need to become aware that Europe can do many things, but it cannot handle, as a risk manager, a pandemic response. And obviously, this looks like a very manifest weakness we have.
Plus, many have been disappointed by the lack of solidarity among EU member states. Just as Italy was desperate for protective gear, countries like Germany were banning their exports.
When Italy and the Italian government asked for help by leveraging on one of the emergency health mechanisms that has been recently created, no European country has actually responded to that particular call. And this was certainly a bit of a shock for many Europeans who would have expected countries, regardless of the competence of the European Union and what it could actually do on health matters, to show some solidarity for those countries who are most affected in a particular moment. That's basically what the European integration project is about. It should be about solidarity.
So, to sum up that message from Alberto, it seems that the European Union is too integrated for each individual country to go it alone. And yet, it's not integrated enough to come up with a coherent response that serves everybody's interests. So, perhaps no wonder it's struggling. But what about the US?
For many Americans, cruise ships like the Grand Princess have come to symbolize the early stages of the outbreak. Hundreds of infections have taken place on ships in various parts of the world. But the disease is spreading on land too, and the outbreak is lagging not far behind Europe. Despite this, for weeks President Donald Trump downplayed the threat posed by the virus.
So far,
We have lost nobody to coronavirus in the United States. Nobody. And it doesn't mean we won't, and we are totally prepared. It doesn't mean we won't. But think of it. You hear 35 and 40,000 people, and we've lost nobody.
As recently as March the 9th, Trump implied in a tweet that major disruption to the economy would not be necessary.
My fellow Americans.
An address to the nation just 2 days later was meant to signal a shift in tone, but Trump's main announcement, a European travel ban, took allies in Europe by surprise. And that lack of coordination frightened the markets. The very next day, US stocks crashed by around 10%, their biggest drop in decades, and there were more falls to come. Trump started appearing at coronavirus briefings more often, but he didn't always manage to inspire confidence.
We have an invisible enemy. We have a problem that a month ago nobody ever thought about. Nobody in the, I've read about it. I read about many years ago, 1917, 1918. I've seen all of the different problems similar to this that we've had. This is a bad one. This is a very bad one. This is bad in the sense that it's so contagious. It's just so contagious, sort of record-setting type contagion. And the good part is the young people they do very well, and healthy people do very well. Very, very bad for older people, especially older people with problems. My focus is really on getting rid of this problem, this virus problem. Once we do that, everything else is going to fall into place. Yes, please.
Well, I think he's just completely ill-equipped to deal with something like this. He's really not, no one ever thought he would do well in a crisis. This is one of the most complex, sort of difficult crises he could be faced with. It's not something that he would sort of recognize or sort of fully understand. He himself, I think, just thought it was just like the flu. He hasn't really kept up with these things. And it's also a complex problem that requires sort of discipline and focused attention to deal with it. None of those are his strong points either. So
Trump still insists, though, that he's on top of the crisis, stressing moves like a travel ban on China that are in tune with his populist instincts.
And on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your response to this crisis?
I'd rate it a 10. I think we've done a great job. And it started with the fact that we kept a very highly infected country, despite all of even the professionals saying, no, it's too early to do that. We were very, very early with respect to China. And we would have a whole different situation in this country if we didn't do that.
But the administration has fallen far short of its own goals on basic essentials like expanding testing capacity, meaning that the outbreak could already be much bigger than it seems. Tom Wright says the administration's performance shows that populism fails to measure up to the challenge.
I do wonder if this will be the end of populism as a governing method. I think, one could see how populists would be winning because of, travel bans and feeling like this virus is coming from overseas and blaming the other. And that's all true. But I think ultimately, people will recognize that to deal with this, you need expertise. You need to believe in an objective reality. You need to believe in science. You need to cooperate with other countries.
So to sum up those thoughts from Tom Wright, it seems that populist leadership and a really complex, fast-moving, highly technical crisis are not necessarily the best mix. So what about authoritarian leadership? Let's turn to China. With infections down dramatically, China is beginning to relax the intense lockdown measures that were imposed in the heat of the crisis, and consumers are venturing back out to the shops. President Xi Jinping has been thanking medical teams in Wuhan, the city where it all began.
你们都穿着防护服啊，戴着口罩啊，我看不到你们的这个真实面貌，但是呢。 你们在我心目中都是最可爱的人，所以我在这里啊，代表党中央 向你们表示诚挚的慰问，致以崇高的敬意。
Longtime China watcher Melissa Chan is based between the US and Germany.
You have this early victory lap by Xi Jinping going to Wuhan, which seems to indicate that the government there has confidence that they've managed to contain the virus and the numbers are down every day.
But go back to the early stages of the crisis and China's response looks more problematic. A lack of information and even suppression meant crucial time was lost at the very beginning of the outbreak. A doctor who rang the alarm bell at the end of last year ultimately caught the disease and died. And any delays in the initial response may turn out to have had grave consequences for the whole world.
People acknowledge that initially there was a cover-up, and at the local level, people are afraid to report negative news to the central government. And of course, that is a major reason why the virus exploded. A lot of people continue to point the blame at China, saying that the world, and whether it's Italy, Germany, or the United States, wouldn't be in the situation it is in now if it hadn't been for the fact that the Chinese government was on it. From the very beginning. I mean, they covered it up for weeks, essentially.
Plus, without a free media, there's no way of checking the data coming out of China. And that problem could now get even worse after Beijing announced that it was kicking out many American journalists.
中方采取的有关措施完全是对美方
There are questions, I think, moving forward about the accuracy of China's numbers. And don't forget that President Xi Jinping did do his semi-victory lap in Wuhan. And so if the numbers actually start going up in China with coronavirus, I think there's every incentive for the government not to want to report it. So again, China is a country that's still one to watch.
So even if China might have had an advantage in imposing those draconian measures when and where it wanted to, that lack of free access to credible information may have had a crippling effect in the early stages of the crisis. And as Melissa Chan points out, another place in Asia might be doing best of all.
I want to look at Taiwan. I mean, it's just been an incredible example. They have multiple flights between mainland China and Taiwan every day. And their numbers are so low that when people show graphs comparing countries in terms of their ability to, bring down the curve, as everyone is saying now, that's become such a common sort of lexicon, that Taiwan doesn't even show up on the graph because the numbers are so low.
And why is that? Well, at least in part, Taiwan is benefiting from its experience with the SARS outbreak back in 2003. It was a very similar virus to the one we now face and required a similar response.
They've just had very, very good measures in place in terms of people coming from certain destinations, landing at the airport, and having medical staff essentially, sort of disinfect everything and check people. And of course, they have a very renowned universal healthcare system. So I think that, a lot of people are kind of almost looking at China with envy, saying, wow, I guess authoritarianism kind of works because they were able to just shut things down and now the virus is contained in China. But look at Taiwan, it's a democracy, and they've managed to do the same.
So let's get back to that question from the very start. Do you have to be a dictatorship to handle a killer virus? I think it's pretty clear at this stage that the answer is no. But all three systems, the US, China, and Europe, are being put through an incredible stress test right now. So what could the long-term consequences for the political landscape be?
For a start, there could be a serious impact on the US-China relationship. Just in January, President Trump signed a Phase 1 deal to ease the tense and long-running trade war. Now things could take a major turn for the worse, with a blame game about the origins of the virus.
Where does this Phase 1 trade deal stand? Is China going to commit to buying all these agricultural products from the United States like they said they would? China has had a very tough time. However way you see it, the coronavirus has impacted the economy there. And they're not in a place necessarily to want to or even have the capacity to buy soybeans from the United States. That's not the primary concern of that state right now. So the phase one trade deal is I think in question. And second of all, of course, you have this acrimony with President Trump calling this a Chinese virus. The president has decided to call this a Chinese virus, knowing, of course, that the Chinese government is on a massive propaganda campaign, both domestically and overseas, that this is a virus that is not from China, believe it or not, and that this is because of the U.S. Army. That kind of conspiracy theory is a very serious accusation that the U.S. is responding to. This is not a good sign that the two world leaders are sort of pointing fingers at each other about the origin of the virus, when frankly, both of them still have a very serious domestic problem on their hands that they should focus on, and they should both be focusing on the health of their citizens.
We are so unified.
But in the US, Donald Trump has another thing on his mind, his election campaign. Tom Wright says that the crisis throws his chances this November into doubt.
I think it poses a real problem for him politically, as people realize that there is an objective reality and that he's gotten this fundamentally wrong and that he's struggling to cope with it. I do think some of his supporters will finally have second thoughts about him, actually.
What about back here in Europe? Alberto thinks we could be in for big change.
What is even more, I would say, paradoxical is that in this particular moment, not only a growing number of Europeans are looking at the European Union as a potential savior of the situation, but also many skeptics, also many Eurosceptics, people who usually argued that the European Union should do less, should not even exist. But now suddenly they realize that Europe, because of its pan-European dimension, because of the inherent transnational dimension of his own operation, could actually provide credible solutions that no single state could actually provide. And obviously this carries incredible political implications, because nationalists and the far right in this particular moment have very little to say besides being a bit racist vis-a-vis China or vis-a-vis populations affected. Because it's pretty clear that no national solution today can be optimal, rather the opposite.
Whether you agree with that or not, wherever you stand on everything we've been talking about, there is one thing that everyone can agree on. Whenever you move around, whenever you do have to go to work, keep washing those hands.